I'd like to talk a little bit about gauge. Gauge can be tricky for newer knitters just because it is uncharted territory, but all gauge is the number of stitches per inch that you get in your knitting. And a patterns gauge is the number of stitches per inch that the designer or author got when they knit that garment in that yarn. So if you want your garment to fit the same as the author of the patterns garment, you have to knit to the same number of stitches per inch that the pattern was knit to. It's okay to get the same gauge on a different size needle. That's just fine. Most gauges are knit in stockinette, meaning knit one row and purl one row, and it's easy then to measure in there. But you always want your gauge to be in the same stitch pattern that the author or designer recommends. So most of the time the pattern will call for a stockinette over 4 inches. They'll want a gauge for in that size. But I find it's much better to knit a wider gauge than they recommend, because as you see that anytime you knit, your side stitches can be kind of wonky, they roll in. Your cast on edge, do we count that or not? Is that part of the 4 inches? So if you knit your swatch larger than 4 inches, you can measure the inside area and you have very nice flat stitches that will behave just as the stitches will behave on your garment. So here I have 28 stitches that I knit in stockinette, and I need to measure 4 inches, so I'm going to measure in the middle for my gauge. To get a proper gauge, you really should take the stitches off of the needle. So I'm going to take it off of the needle here, because then your knitting behaves just naturally, just how it will on your body. And then you need to measure over 4 inches the stitches. So I'm going to start here with my ruler in the middle of my knitting, and I'm going to go plenty away from the cast on edge, and I'm not going to measure toward the sides. As I said, those stitches are rolling and kind of wonky. So I'm going to start here at the number 0, and I'm going to look for the first V, because that's my first knit stitch at the number 0, and I'm just putting a little pin there to mark that. And then I'm going to come over here to the 4 inch and find the full knit stitch that's marked there, and I will put a pin there. Now if I had a stitch that just straddled that 4 inches, meaning if the 4 inch that only had a half of a stitch, that's okay. You just mark wherever the 4 inch mark is, put your pin in, and then we can count how many stitches we have in between my 2 pins. So I'm just going to count the V's, or the knit stitches. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. So I have 21 stitches over 4 inches. So if I divide 21 by 4, I have 5.25 stitches per inch. So that would be my gauge for this swatch, and that's what I achieved when I knit with this needle size in stockinette. So hopefully that's what my pattern called for. But let's just say that the pattern wanted me to have more stitches per inch, say 6 stitches per inch. Well, then I would need to use a smaller needle, because that would give me smaller stitches or more stitches in this 4 inch area. And on the other side is if the pattern called for, say, 4 stitches per inch, I would need to have my stitches be bigger. So if I knit with a bigger needle, I will have less stitches per inch, and then I would get the correct gauge that way. Hopefully this has cleared a few things up for you. Happy knitting!